Barron Trump, the 19-year-old son of Donald Trump, had no desire to attract attention. He grew up surrounded by luxury and constant cameras, and although he was 19, he already felt what it was like to be under a constant microscope. His life, despite its outward glamour, was filled with alienation. His school years were no less difficult. He was criticized for his last name, whispered about behind his back, and even his teachers doubted his abilities. But what irritated him most was that people thought he didn't understand this and wasn't capable of achieving things on his own. When Barron found out that he would be tested by his new teacher, he wasn't particularly surprised. She, like many others, had the impression that he was stupid. All his previous teachers had treated him with caution, subconsciously perceiving him as the child of rich parents. So it was easy for them not to believe in his intellect. This time, things seemed a little different. Mrs. Hampton, the young, energetic teacher with academic ambitions, looked at him as if he were just another wealthy kid with no thoughts or abilities. So, when she received the task to test his knowledge of history, it became her chance to show who was truly cool in the class. Barron sat in the front row. His black jacket looked perfect, even if he were sitting in a gymnasium rather than a classroom. His eyes were serious but also interested, as he knew this test wouldn't be ordinary. Mrs. Hampton began the lesson with general questions, going through each student one by one. When it was Barron's turn, she pretended not to notice that his last name was again on the list. She leaned over her desk, sliding her gaze over her notes, and asked with a smile, "Barron, do you think your father's presidency had enough smart decisions in its politics? And can you answer this without a political context?" A silence fell over the class. Everyone looked at Barron, waiting for him to either speak up or remain silent. Mrs. Hampton raised her eyebrows, as if the question was difficult for a simple teenager. However, Barron didn't rush to answer. He paused as if considering every word. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and confident. "I think every president faces challenges in their politics. But that doesn't mean all decisions will be right. They can be viewed from different perspectives. For example, when we evaluate what's been done, not who did it. I believe it's important to look at the result, not the context from which that result comes." The class fell silent, and even Mrs. Hampton, who had been ready for the usual reaction from Barron, was surprised. She nodded, but her tone didn't change. "And what can you say about the policies that caused economic problems in the country? How would you solve the problem?" Barron raised an eyebrow and refocused. "This issue isn't just about politics, it's about management and balance. If I were in power, I wouldn't make hasty conclusions. I would first observe all the data, and then gather opinions from different people, those who know, not just those who speak grand words. You need to listen carefully." Mrs. Hampton was frankly surprised. She expected Barron to answer either trivially or uncertainly, but this time he behaved differently. And although his answers weren't revolutionary, they conveyed not just education, but a clear and sober perspective on complex situations. The dialogue continued for a few more minutes, and the teacher began to realize that he wasn't the person she had imagined. Barron responded calmly, confidently, but not aggressively. Every gesture, every word showed that he might not be what he seemed at first glance. The class gradually began to change its attitude toward him. Mrs. Hampton, though not ready to change her attitude, realized that she had underestimated his abilities. Barron continued to sit quietly, without unnecessary emotions, but internally he felt that he had taken a small step toward proving to everyone that even he, the president's son, didn't need to prove his worth through shouting or aggression. The lesson ended without incident. Barron remained calm, and the teacher, though not showing it, began to understand that this was not just Trump's son, this was a young man with his own view of the world. Barron Trump sat at his desk in the classroom, with a heavy sense of expectation that seemed to hang invisibly over him. He knew today was going to be an important day. His eyes were focused on Mrs. Stevens, the teacher, who was standing by the board, preparing for what was supposed to be just another lesson. But for him, this wasn't just any lesson, it was a real test. Mrs. Stevens, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, was always strict, but today her eyes seemed to shine with a particular indifference. The other students were seated in their places, absorbed in the routine schoolwork, but Barron could feel the tension filling the room. Mrs. Stevens tried to remain as objective as always, but every move she made and every word she spoke seemed to carry a hidden judgment. This guy, Trump's son, can't possibly be as smart as he thinks, she thought, glancing at Barron. He always seemed strange to her, awkward and out of place. She, of course, knew who he was and had probably unintentionally formed a certain opinion of him. Barron felt her gaze, but he tried not to pay attention. He didn't want people judging him for who his father was. He had his own aspirations, his own dreams. And he couldn't afford to fail at whatever he did. No, not today. And that's why, when Mrs. Stevens finally addressed the class, he raised his hand slowly. "Barron, what do you know about 20th century American history?" she asked with a slight rise in her voice, as though the question was a formality. Barron calmly lowered his gaze to his notebook, trying to recall what he had studied at home. Facts flashed through his mind, but what mattered was he didn't want to tailor his answer to anyone's expectations. He decided he would answer as he saw fit. America went through numerous changes during the 20th century. From the Great Depression to the post-World War II period, the country tried to adapt to new realities, he began, speaking clearly and calmly. You can also mention the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s when the civil rights movements gained momentum, and the post-war economic boom. Mrs. Stevens narrowed her eyes as she listened to his answer. Barron spoke confidently, but was it enough to dispel all the doubts in her mind? "Perhaps you're just reading all this to impress us," she said, placing her pen on the desk. "It's great that you know history, but I would like to hear what you really understand about the state of the world today." Barron sighed. His gaze was no longer as confident, but he decided not to give her the chance to set a trap. There was a steely determination burning inside him. He raised his head and looked her in the eye. "Maybe I don't understand everything that's going on in the world, Mrs. Stevens, but I know that people shouldn't judge others based on their parents or social status. You yourself often say that education should provide opportunities for everyone, regardless of their background." The teacher paused for a moment. Her face shifted, a tiny shadow of surprise appearing, but she tried to maintain her posture as the strict mentor. "Maybe, but because of your status, people will always judge you," she said, raising her eyebrows. "You can't just offer the illusion of change for others when your opportunities are as vast as your background." Barron found it hard to breathe. He could feel the tension in the room rising. All the students were trying not to look at him, but he felt their attention like a deliberately increased weight on his shoulders. Maybe it was hard for her to believe that someone with his background could think differently than others and that it wasn't just political ideas. "You're right, I can't change my background," he said calmly, but with bitterness. "But I have the right to grow, regardless of who my father is. And I want to prove this, not to you, but to myself." Mrs. Stevens took a brief pause, trying to process what she had just heard. She knew her position would spark a strong reaction in many, but she wasn't pleased that Barron wasn't responding as she expected. "Do you think that by saying this, you'll prove your point?" she asked, raising her eyebrows in disdain. "I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone," Barron cut in. "I just want to be myself." The class fell silent. Barron could hear his heart beating in his chest, but he remained calm. He wasn't going to succumb to this fight, his goal was clear, and he wasn't going to let anyone question his desire to be heard. The silence in the classroom grew thicker. Barron sat, not taking his eyes off the teacher, feeling her intense gaze burning through him. He tried not to let his emotions show, not to let her win in this psychological battle. But he could feel how each of her words, even the smallest insinuation, was trying to push him into some kind of compromise, to make him submit to her authority. But he was ready to stand his ground until the end. Mrs. Stevens took a deep breath and watched him for a few seconds, as if preparing to say something else. Her face became serious, and a slight anxiety flickered in her eyes. After all, she was a teacher, and in her mind, there were many formulas for how to handle students who didn't fit into the usual mold. She saw in him not only the son of a politician but something more, a challenge that was hard to accept. "You want to be yourself?" she asked again, but this time her voice was softer. "And who are you, Barron, when you take off your father's mask?" What is your real goal? What do you want? Barron paused for a moment. She didn't understand, but that was even good. Because sometimes, he wasn't sure about what he really wanted. But he couldn't give up now. Not here. I want to show that not everything in this world is decided by one's origins, he replied calmly, not looking away. And I'm not trying to outdo my father. I want to create myself. And for that, there's no need to look for paths in the shadows. The classroom remained quiet, but Barron could feel the classmates' gazes piercing into him. Some were openly surprised by his answer, others even a little upset. Mrs. Stevens hadn't expected this turn of events, and it was palpable. You have ideas, Barron. That's undeniable. But don't you think that on your path, there will be more people trying to prove to you that you can't be who you want to be? Barron sighed. She seemed to be trying to show him that the world wasn't that simple. And he knew she was right. But his response was clear. I'm ready for that. And I won't give up. Because in the end, only I can decide who I will be. The teacher stared at him for a few more seconds. Then, as if realizing that there was no point in continuing this game, she sighed and turned back to the board. All right, Barron, she said again. I hope you keep this confidence when the time comes to make a choice that will truly change your life. But for now, let's continue with the lesson. Barron nodded, though he felt that the internal struggle inside him was far from over. He felt as if he had won this battle, but the war was still ahead. The war between his aspirations and those who would try to stop him. As soon as the lesson ended, Barron left the classroom and, walking down the corridor, felt the gazes on him. He was sure this wasn't the end. And that perhaps even the people who were now watching him with curiosity or distrust would eventually understand that he wasn't just someone's son. He was more than what they thought of him. His plan was just beginning. Barron walked down the corridor, feeling the weight of each step. But there was something important in it. His steps became more confident as he knew he was on the right path, even though he understood that many difficulties awaited him ahead. Here he was, at a crossroads, between his own choice and the influence of others. When he stepped outside, it was almost silent. The summer sun illuminated the city, and a light coolness hung in the air. He paused for a few seconds to take a deep breath, as if absorbing the surrounding world. This was the moment when he could stop and realize what truly mattered to him. The choice he had made was difficult, but he felt that it wasn't just a fight for recognition, it was a fight for himself. He was no longer his father's shadow. He didn't want to become like them all. He had his own path. The next few days passed with a sense of change. He started spending more time reflecting, looking for new opportunities, and talking to other people who didn't feel the pressure of his family name. And although it was difficult, he felt new doors opening. Doors where no one would ask him who he was by his father's name. And although no path was easy, Barron knew he was ready for any challenges. He was no longer afraid of what others thought of him. And even when he met the gazes of his classmates, he no longer felt that pressure that had once limited him. It was a moment of inner victory. He realized that the path to his true self would never be easy, but that was exactly what he had been striving for. A few years later, when Barron returned to his hometown, he was no longer just the son of a politician. He was a successful young man who had built his own business, earned respect, and carved out his place in the world. He didn't choose the easy paths and didn't chase after popularity. He had a goal, to be himself. In the end, Barron found his way, and although the road was difficult, he never doubted that the right choice had been made. And even when people asked him questions, he answered calmly, "I am who I am." And that's what matters.